Welcome back to Let's Make a Game, a channel about making computer role-playing games using the free program Twine and the Sugarcube format for Twine. In this video, I would like to continue my series on first-person graphics. If you've been following this series, you'd know that when we finished the last video, I had demonstrated a system for creating a virtual environment which met all of the requirements that I'd set for myself, which were that there should be a little bit of variety, it should be different each time. It should be quick, and that was very important because there are a lot of systems for generating labyrinths or mazes on the internet, but when I applied them to Twine, at least to a largish environment, they turned out extremely slow. They weren't really usable, and in fact, I had to abandon the idea of generating the whole environment and then dropping the player in it, and instead generate the environment as we go. So we start with an environment that's mostly undefined, and then when a player gets to a new part, we just sort of generate that bit. As I tested different methods, I also found that I didn't want long tunnels, because long tunnels without side paths, sometimes it can be difficult to know whether the player has moved or not, or whether the player character has moved or not, and that can be, I found it quite frustrating. And we wanted the player to be able to access basically all or most of the environment. We didn't want random chance to mean that the player was likely to be sort of cut off and restricted to a small area. It's very easy to make a random environment. You just have a two-dimensional array and set every square to 0 or 1 randomly, and 0 is open space and 1 is a wall. But the problem with doing that is that it's very likely that the player will end up restricted to only a few squares and won't end up being able to see the whole area. In fact, most of it will be wasted. And of course, you can have methods to test for that and ensure it doesn't happen, but then you have the problem that they're not quick. And so, we ended up with a system that did all of the things that I wanted it to do. The weakest, I'd say, is probably variety. There is a certain amount of variety in the system that we had, but it is quite repetitive. It's based on a similar pattern that repeats with variations throughout the whole environment. And I did feel that the variety was a little bit lacking. So what I want to do in this video is show you a couple of changes that I've made that make it a little bit more varied. So we're here facing south, and if you have seen the previous videos, you will probably recognize the environment that we're in. And you'd probably expect that looking south would be the entrance to another repetition of the same pattern. But in this case, it's not, because of one of the changes I've made. This area of the dungeon in front of us, to the south of us, has been filled in or sealed off. And that is one of the changes that I've made. The main problem with doing that, with defining particular parts of it as being sealed off, is that again, you have to make sure that you're not cutting off the player. It wouldn't be very good if you had the areas to the north, south, west, and east of the player all sealed off and they couldn't sort of get anywhere. And the system that allows for that to happen, or rather stops that happening, I'll show you when we get to the code. But first I'll show you the other thing that I've changed, and this one's a lot more minor and a lot easier to do. If we go north, we can see that we have this area of open space. This is this area that we didn't have before, where normally we'd expect there to be, we expect essentially this square here. Sorry, I'll keep picking up pictures. This square here, or really it's a parallelogram, but it's meant to represent a square. This square here, we would expect that to be wall, but it's open space. And I've set it up so that some of them don't have that central, the central wall in the pattern. So let's have a look at the code that allows that to happen. So we have, I'll just zoom in a bit, there we go. We have one new page, this one, and we've added some code to the other pages. So let's start with the initialize page. We have $A and $B are the main ones, the main things we need to look at today. So this you will recognize if you saw the previous video. $A was a two-dimensional array that outlined the basic shape of the pattern that creates the dungeon. So imagine this as being a set of squares in the dungeon, and imagine the ones as being walls and the zeros as being paths or open space. So we can see that we have a sort of central wall or a central pillar, and then we have an open path around it, and then we have exits to the north, south, west, and east. And that is the basic pattern of the dungeon with some variations. I should say that this 5x5 pattern overlaps. So if we were, let's say here, and we went north and then east and then into another pattern, the leftmost column of that pattern would be the rightmost column of this pattern, or the westmost column of the new pattern would be the eastmost column of this pattern. And that means that these right-hand numbers have to be the same as these left-hand numbers, 1, 1, 0, 1, 1. And the top set of numbers has to be the same as the bottom set of numbers, 1, 1, 0, 1, 1, 1, 1, 0, 1, 1. Because if they were different, when we created the new pattern, we might change one of these squares that's already been defined. And if we changed it, that would look weird. It would look like a mistake, like something in the dungeon had changed. Now, you might want to have moving walls and stuff in the dungeon, but you probably want to have them be quite rare. And you might want to have some sort of something to tell the player it's not a mistake. Like you might have a message that says, oh, one of the walls slid over, or it plays a sound or something like that. You don't want to have it as a routine thing, I think, most of the time. So you probably recognize this, but we've turned this two-dimensional array into a three-dimensional array, as well as dimensions representing west to east and north to south. We have another dimension representing which pattern we're using, and we have a second pattern. And that pattern is essentially that it's all ones, except for these 4 zeros in the north, south, west, and east. The reason we have those 4 zeros rather than turning it into ones is because that's what this pattern has, and because the patterns overlap, we need the top one of this to be the same as the bottom one of this, and this right one needs to match with this left one, and vice versa, and they all need to be 1, 1, 0, 1, 1. So that's why we have those little alcoves. Later on, of course, we might make a virtue of necessity, and we might say that those little alcoves sometimes have particular things in them, objects you can interact with or whatever. But for now, it's just a necessity if we want to have the patterns overlap. And the reason we want to have the patterns overlap, we could easily have just programmed it so that they're separate sets of 5 by 5. But I find that that creates a long tunnel, and that was something that I wanted to avoid, which I've explained before already in the video. So that's the change we've made to A. To make a three-dimensional array, you have to do a similar thing to what you do to make a two-dimensional array, but do it one more time. So when you have a two-dimensional array like B, you have to go through each slot that you'll be using and define it as itself being an array, usually with a for loop. With a three-dimensional array, you have to do that, and then you have to go through each slot in the two-dimensional array and define each of those slots as itself being an array. Now, in this case, it's quite small, so I could do it by hand. I didn't need any for loops. We just said A is an array, A0 and A1 are arrays, A00 is this array, A01 is this array, and so on. But because it's just 5 by 5 by 2, there's only 2 patterns. But if these dimensions got bigger, it would start to be impractical to do it by hand, and we'd have to be doing it with for loops. But yeah, luckily we only have the 2 patterns, the filled-in pattern and the normal pattern. So every set of 5 by 5 squares, which I sometimes call a block, every block is going to be either this one or this one. And we could do it as we go, but that would be a little bit complicated in terms of making sure we didn't seal the player in. And it would also mean that the direction that you went changed the probabilities of different areas being filled in. And that seemed kind of weird to me. So what I've done is I've defined it all at the start, and that's what the B array does. For each block, each set of 5 by 5, each overlapping set of 5 by 5 squares, the B array will have a value, that slot will have a value of either 1 or 0, with 0 meaning the normal pattern and 1 meaning the filled-in pattern. So here's how we do that. So we've defined B as a two-dimensional array, and we go through and we set everything to 0 or 1, but to avoid sealing the player in, we check all the neighbours that have already been filled in, and that includes diagonal neighbours. So we will check to the south, the west, but also the southwest and the northwest. And we only check in those directions because we're filling it in a particular order, and there's no point checking the neighbours that haven't been filled in yet. So we start with the lower left-hand corner. We say that is either 1 or 0. Then we do the leftmost column. So we have a for loop that goes from 2 to by, not from 1 to by, because we've already done 1, 1. And we say if b1, y1 minus 1 is equal to 1, in other words, if the block below this is filled in, well, this block has to be open. Otherwise, it can be either 1 or 0. Having done the leftmost column, we then do the rest of the array except for the top row. And the reason for that is because the neighbours that we're checking are slightly different in the top row. So we have an x1 that goes from 2 to bx, not 1, because we've already filled in the ones where the x value is 1. 2 to bx, and we go for y1, we go from 1 to 1 less than by. So it's not y1 is under or equal to by, it's y1 is under by. And we have a very long bit of code that checks all the neighbours, which I'll get to in a second. But if any of those are 1, then we set this slot to 0, otherwise it can be 0 or 1. So one consequence of this, by the way, is that not all of the squares, not all of the blocks have the same probability of being filled in. Like this one has a 50, 1, 1 has a 50, sorry, let me go to the right bit. 1, 1 has a 50% chance of being filled in. The others have a less than that, like the ones in the leftmost column have basically a 25% chance of being filled in, because if the one below them, actually no, it wouldn't be exactly 25%. The one above, immediately above 1, 1 has a 25% chance of being filled in, because if B1, 1 is 1, then B1, 2 has to be 0. And if B1, 1 is 0, then B1, 2 can be 0 or 1. And that works out to a 25% chance. Then the one above that has a different chance again, because B1, 2 has a 25% chance, not a 50% chance of being 1, and so on. So it's not sort of even, it's slightly asymmetrical, but I don't think that it's such that the player is going to notice. And the speed is very important. There's so many systems that we could use that are much more rigorous and probably give better results, but they're so slow that they're not really practical for using in Twine. So anyway, so we fill in this column, the leftmost column, and we fill in the rest of the array except for the top row. So the neighbours that we're checking, if B x1 minus 1 y1, that's the one to the west. x1 y1 minus 1, that's the one to the south. x1 minus 1 y1 minus 1, that's the one to the southwest. And x1 minus 1 y1 plus 1, that's the one to the northwest. That one there is why we do the top row separately, because on the top row, y1 plus 1 is out of the range that we're looking for. So if any of those are 1, we set this one to 0. Otherwise, we set it to 0 or 1. And then we do the top row. The top row is exactly the same. It has exactly this code, except for not the last one. So there's only 3 possibilities. If B x1 minus 1 y is 1, which is to the west, x1. And the other thing, of course, is that there's no y1. We're just using by, because this is only the top row, i.e. it's only the ones where the y value is equal to by. So x1 minus 1 by, that's to the west. x1 by minus 1, that's to the south. And x1 minus 1 by minus 1, that's the one to the southwest. We don't check the one to the northwest because that's out of the range. So if any of those are 1, we set that slot of B to 0, or we set it, otherwise we set it to randomly 0 or 1. All right, there is no change in the outer wall code. There is a slight change in the position, because we don't want to drop the player in a filled in block of 5 by 5. So we have to check that. So we set u and v to be random numbers from 1 to bx and 1 to by. And if b uv is equal to 1, then we include position, which means we start again from the top, essentially. Otherwise, and I made a slight mistake in this code before, but I think in the last video, but anyway, it's corrected now. So u and v represent the block, and therefore we set x1 and y1, which are the lower left-hand corner of the starting block, to be u times 4 minus 3 and v times 4 minus 3 respectively. So why those? Well, let's say u is 1. Well, that will give us a total of 1. And obviously, same is true of if v is 1. So let's say we are in block 1, 1. Well, obviously the square that's the lower left-hand corner of that block is going to be square 1, 1. So that's right. But let's say u is 2. So we're in block 2, 1. Well, that will be 2 times 4 is 8 minus 3 is 5. And of course, that will still be 1. Well, 5 is the one that we want, because remember, although they're 5 by 5, they overlap. So this block that'll be 1, 1. this one here, even though it's in this block, is also the lower left-hand corner of block 2-1. And the same is true of block 3-1. That would be one of the squares that already exists in the second block as well, as a consequence of the blocks overlapping. So I don't know if I've explained that terribly well, but the point is we multiply the block number by 4 and subtract 3 to get the number of the square. And then we go to create block. And create block is slightly different because remember that we're filling in squares that might be using this pattern, or they might be using this pattern, depending on the value of the relevant slot in the B array. It used to be that we were only using this, and it was a 2-dimensional array, but now it's a 3-dimensional array. So we set M. This is the slot. This is the square that we're currently filling in, and now we have a slightly more complicated code. Well, X3 and Y3 are just the for loop that we're using, but we have this new dimension, which is $B, $U, $V, which is we look at the X and Y coordinates of the block, we look at that slot in B, and that tells us, are we filling in all of the ones that begin with, are we filling in A0 something something, or are we filling in A1 something something? In other words, are we filling in this lot, which is A0 something something, or are we filling in this lot, which is A1 something something? And the other thing we need to do is we need to have a value for U and V. In other words, we need to know the number of the block that we're filling in. Well, we've got that when we have position, but we also need to make a little change in display, which is that we need to work out what U and V is. And we do that basically by the reverse of what we did here. Here we started with U and V, and then we derived X1 and Y1 from it by multiplying by 4 and then subtracting 3. Here we start with X1 and Y1 and we derive U and V from them, and basically you do the reverse operations in the reverse order. So here we multiplied it by 4 and then subtracted 3. So we reverse that order, subtract 3 and then times by 4, but then we change the operation to the opposite one. So instead of subtract 3 times by 4, we add 3 and then divide by 4. So we go x the square number plus 3 and then that number divided by 4. And that will give us, once, given the square number of the lower left-hand corner of the block, this is how we derive the block number. And then we go to create block and we fill it in as either a normal pattern or a filled in pattern. And the only other change that I've made is down below, and these changes don't, as I've said here, I've made a little note that say the changes below won't make any difference to a filled in block. And we had this before, but we had it as if random 1 to 2 equals 1. So we had a 50% chance. Instead, we've now got an equal chance of an extra block or the empty center, the empty spaces without the middle bit. So we have, if random 1 to 3 equals 1, then we do this, which I've talked about before, which creates the extra block, which makes it a little bit harder to get around. Else if random 1 to 2 equals 1, then we simply set the square in the middle, which is this one, x1 plus 2, y1 plus 2, because x1 and y1 are the lower left-hand corner, and these blocks are 5 by 5 squares, so x1 plus 2, y1 plus 2 is the center square. We set that to 0, where normally the pattern would set it to 1. So it will happen with the filled-in blocks as well. It just won't make any difference. In these filled-in blocks, sometimes this middle bit will be 0, but you'll never get to it, so it doesn't make any difference. Unless we were to have game mechanics that allow you to teleport, and then we could maybe say that some of these have, you know, something special in them or something like that. But at the moment, when we've just got zeros and ones, it doesn't make any difference, and we can only move, you know, from one block to the next. It's forever inaccessible to us. So those are the changes I've made, and they add a slight amount of variety to the environment, as much as we can have, I think, while fulfilling the other requirements of speed and accessibility to all areas of the environment. But of course, the environment is empty. It's an empty dungeon. It's a dungeon with no traps and no monsters and no obstacles and anything else. So what we can do to make the environment more interesting is we can start to add actual obstacles. So, for example, in an open space, we could turn an open space into a door, and we could have some sort of thing that you have to roll against your strength or something like that to kick the door down. Or there's some game element. Perhaps the door is, you know, won't let you through unless you answer a riddle or whatever. There's some game element that stops the player's progress, and that's the sort of thing that we're going to start to work on in future videos in this series. But for now, I hope that was useful or interesting to at least some of you, and I hope you will tune in next time.